you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to talk through some thoughts about the second part of Cracking India. So I'm going to share my screen and talk you through a PowerPoint. This is a pretty hard portion of the book. The first part, the first third of it is much more lighthearted. The second part really gets into the violence that's happening around Lenny during the partition. So, just another quick content warning that this is a sort of hard situation to talk through, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in the book that is that might be triggering. So, our agenda for this video, I'm gonna remind you a little bit about the circumstances surrounding the partition, and then I'm basically just going to talk through some important concepts and scenes in this second part, and then talk you through the discussion post, which is just a few questions to get you thinking about some of these important concepts. So, the partition of India, isn't that beautiful? Okay, so as I mentioned in last week's video, India entered World War II without Indian political leaders being consulted. So Britain, who was in control of India at the time, entered World War II and basically committed Indian forces on behalf of the Allies. So so at the time, they sort of said that their support for the war effort was contingent on Indian independence at the end of the armed conflict. So they went back and forth a lot about this. But after the end of World War II, Britain did finally agree to grant India independence. Nehru, who we talked a little bit last week, played a major role in the negotiations, as did Gandhi, as did Jinnah, who are some of the names that you've seen pop up in the books. Factions in India, as we've talked about, were split between Hindu and Muslim. Those who wanted a united secular India, led by Nehru and Gandhi, and the Muslim League led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who argued more strongly for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, which ended up happening, right? That ended up being the case. And Pakistan was in two separate places, one where we know of it today, and the second piece was where Bangladesh is now, right? So it was India sort of in the middle, Pakistan on either side. So the impact of this is what we really want to get into. It was followed by upheavals, extreme violence, and chaotic migration of more than 14 million people between the countries. The haphazard partition lines cut many communities, families, and farms in two and altered religious demographics as Indian Muslims crossed into Pakistan and Hindus and Sikhs left what is now Pakistan for India. People fled from their homes, leaving all their possessions behind. Many feared discrimination and communal or ethnic violence. The ensuing bloodbath claimed the lives of around 1 million people. I just want to sit with that for a second. Like, this event in history claimed 1 million lives. And I bet most of you hadn't heard of it before now, which is really incredible. It is a harrowing event. And as we sort of talked a little bit last week, it's sort of the consequence of colonial intervention and the sort of, like it says here, these haphazard lines drawn that really sort of split communities. So it says here, survivors tell stories of former neighbors and friends turning on each other and committing violent acts of murder and rape without legal ramifications. Many who witnessed the atrocities worry that the injustices of that horrific period will be forgotten by future generations, especially given its proximity to the Holocaust, which is covered more frequently in classrooms, right? We all know about the horrors, the absolute horrors of the Holocaust. But of course, this was happening, around the same time, or slightly after, and it does get overlooked and isn't studied very much, which is part of why I wanted us to read this book. And a lot of this impact is reflected in the events of the story. We can see a lot of this is happening in Cracking India. So some important concepts and scenes that I want to talk through. The first one is this idea of dehumanization. and sort of mob mentality, right? I assigned you guys a very short NPR segment on somebody who's attempting to preserve oral histories of the partition. So from that, this is a quote: "It's very easy to dehumanize the other side," she says. And I think that's the key. It allows us to do horrific things. When we start talking about them and how they are, it absolves us of the responsibility of recognizing them as human, and of our values as being universal. And we can see how this plays out pretty clearly in Cracking India. The friend group that we see, and that's really tight in the first part of the book, end up cracking themselves, right? Some even join the violence because of the violence they see enacted upon their people, right? And this is sort of played out along the lines of religious separatism. So in part 2 of the book, we start seeing the ethnic and religious heterogeneity of Lenny's family circle start to deteriorate, right? Like I said, the sort of cracks start to form. One of the last scenes in which the group of friends surrounding Aya are all together is at the very beginning of chapter 11. They all go to the garden together, like they have in several scenes throughout the book. But then right after that, we get this sort of fracture moment, and Lenny says or writes, quote, "There is much disturbing talk. India is going to be broken. Can one break a country?" And this is sort of the theme throughout, like how these sort of arbitrary political decisions are impacting these individuals so profoundly. And she says here, "And I become aware of religious differences. It is sudden. One day everybody is themselves, and the next day they are Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian. People shrink, dwindle into symbols. Aya is no longer just my all-encompassing Aya. She is also a token," right? So I really like this quote because I think it gives us a sense of what this separatism can do. It can reduce people just to a symbol, just to sort of a token of what they believe and not their whole being, right? We see sort of as the book moves on, the fractures that occur within this group and the awareness of that from Lenny. This is another instance where the child narrator really sort of highlights the changes because she isn't aware of these differences in the people that surround her. She might notice the different clothes that they wear. She'll notice, the different foods that they eat, but she doesn't see them as different kinds of people, right? So this is also her sort of becoming aware of those differences. And you might sort of think to yourself, like when you realize that there are different kinds of people in the world, right? Like when you sort of realized racial difference, or sort of came to realize that not everybody believed in the same thing that you did, that people have very different ideologies. And this is sort of on a smaller scale, that even just the people that she's surrounded with all the time are really different and have different stakes in this really huge political world right now. So that brings me to, these parallel scenes. So I mentioned on the last slide that we're sort of following Lenny through this atrocity. And the author often uses parallel scenes in the text to emphasize what has changed in the world and for Lenny. So it's a good sort of textual strategy, because we're learning to see the world differently as both she's growing up and as this violence escalates, right? So the parallel scenes that I've chosen to emphasize here, last week we talked about the scene with the gardener being bullied, right? So sort of like they were all playing together. It was very lighthearted, right? But then it sort of changed tone on a dime. We have another scene in which Hari, the Hindu gardener, is bullied about his dhoti, his pants. But this time it's much more sinister. So the tone from the beginning has shifted. So here's a quote. "Again, they are after Hari's dhoti, but instead of the light, quick patter of bare feet, there's a harsh scrape and drag of leather on frozen earth." So we can see even from the beginning of this scene that the tone is different, that it does sound more sinister, right? Instead of this light, quick patter, we've got harsh scrapes and drags. So even in the syntax that she's using, even in the way that she's describing this event, the tone is quite different. And then finally, there's one more scene that we see Hari, because he converts. Because of his fear, right? He converts to Islam and changes his name to Hamad Ali. So in the scene in which the group of Muslim men come to Lenny's family's house, this is right at the end of the portion I assigned you, we again see an attempt to see under his pants, right? To sort of take off his pants, literally. And if he hadn't converted, he would have likely been killed in that moment, right? So there's this escalation between sort of a friendly, playful scene to something a little bit more sinister, to something that could have resulted in his death, right? Poking fun at each other's differences, all the way to, violence and potential murder, right? So she does this with a few different scenes, not just with Hari the gardener, but with a number of them. And you can see how this violence escalates, and also you can see how Lenny's understanding and perception of the scenes differ as well. Okay, so we've been talking about this sort of horrible mass violence that's occurring in this novel. And we, from the beginning, we're sort of talking about the separatism and the dehumanization. And Ice Candy Man is really at the center of this. So, Lenny has this name for him because he sells popsicles to children, right? He has a crush on her nanny, right? They see him in the park. He is one of their friend group. But then he really becomes an enemy of anyone who isn't Muslim after the ghost train incident. So this is a really horrible situation that did happen on multiple occasions during the partition, where a train of refugees traveling from one part of the sort of torn country to another to sort of escape violence end up being killed. So when they arrive, the train is literally full of dead bodies. And that's what happened in this scene. So after Ice Candy Man sort of sees this, he changes completely. He becomes a part of the violence, right? He wants to take revenge. So, I mentioned this because it's sort of hard to understand this level of violence, this level of sort of catastrophe that's happening. And then you see somebody like Ice Candy Man, who, was a friend from the beginning, and then, completely turns into somebody who's really committing some horrible acts of violence because of what he sees as this horrible atrocity that was committed against his own people. Right. And that brings me, let's see. Yeah, I guess that's where I wanted to end. I just wanted to take it back really quick to the sort of idea about dehumanization, and the NPR segment was talking about how, so many people look back and say, like, how did we do this? Like, what happened? But it was really just it was the people themselves. And this dehumanization that allowed this to happen. Okay, so after all of that, basically, I want you to think about one of these concepts, plus another one that I didn't really get to. So for your discussion post this week, choose one of the following questions to answer, as usual, in a 250-word post. Then read your peers' post and comment on someone's who chose a different prompt than your own. Yeah, so we want you to read everybody's, but you only need to comment on two people. Yeah, comment on two posts who chose different prompts than yours. So here are the three prompts that you can choose from. One, what is another example of parallel scenes that you noticed in the novel? So, like I talked about with the gardener, there's sort of three of them, but there are several other ones that you could choose as well. Describe the scenes and how things have changed from both a political and narratorial perspective. So what I mean by that, like, how have things changed politically? How does that sort of impact the interactions? And how do things change from Lenny's perspective? Okay, number 2, now that you know more about the partition and its violent impact, think again about the child narrator's perspective on the historical events described here. How does the child's perspective change and shape what we read? So choose a scene and analyze through the lens of the child narrator. Again, now that we sort of are, things are escalating, the dehumanization element, there's a lot that we're sort of learning through Lenny's eyes. So think about that now that you sort of have this background. And then finally, and we're going to talk more about this next week in the final part of Cracking India, think about the role that gender plays in the novel. What different powers do men and women have? How has the violence of the partition impacted men and women differently? And I want you to include quotes from the text to strengthen your claims on all of these, but definitely on this one as well. Okay, that is all for this week. Next week, your first short essay is due, so make sure that you are on that. And of course, let me know if you have any questions about anything, and I will see you all again very shortly. All right, have a great day. Bye.